Hello and welcome back to the second part of this little document deep dive series on the Battle of Wypolzowo. Make sure to watch the first one to know what's going on. That said, I need to revise some things because new information has surfaced thanks to Radio Smash, our researcher over at Forgotten Op 2, who found some additional information. For one thing, he found this sketch here. This was part of the infantry report on this battle, which I have been reading from. However, like the infantry report I got was from the 3rd Panzer Division folder, but apparently they never sent them this sketch, but it was in their folder and Radio Smash found it. So this actually shows us where exactly the infantry companies were positioned, and I got it mostly right from the written description, with one exception. I was not aware, and it doesn't really say in the report, that the perimeter actually extended all the way into Maksimovo. Actually, most of Maksimovo, the neighboring village, was also under their control. And the 6th company that came in later as reinforcements actually had set up there. So yeah, that's new information, and I will now edit the Google Earth layer, or whatever that's called, to reflect these new infos. So, just to reiterate, this is what I came up with last time, but I will slightly change it. Namely, these two companies will be moved a little bit, as well as third company down here will be moved down, and then it should be more accurate. Alright, so this is closer to the actual deployment. The rest was correct. Now, just to remind you, I will read alternatively from the 3rd Panzer AAR and the infantry AAR, and we had stopped at the end of 11th January. So we will start now in the morning of the 12th of January, and you will already get a sense of déjà vu because there are some events here that are kind of doubled up, and I get the impression that the timelines between the two units don't entirely fit. So there's probably a mistake in there somewhere, but it's actually good to get caught back up, I guess. Just a general reminder, they had seized this area here and were now surrounded by the Russians in the surrounding villages and forests. So yeah, we will see how that goes. Oh, one more thing actually. Radio Smash also found a Russian blog. Actually, it's the same blog that I already used once for the French submachine gun video. I will link to it in the description. And that blog has the complete Russian documentation basically summed up for this battle, including some interesting details, and I will refer to that. I won't read out the complete Russian documents, but I will refer to that at some points where it's interesting, you will see. Alright, so let's see, 12th January. And we are with the infantry here. At 0030 hours, Motorcycle Battalion 3, that's from the 3rd Panzer Division, established contact through a reconnaissance patrol. This connection was secured by additional reconnaissance patrols. The divisional order to hold Wypolzowo remained in force. Later, the enemy tanks were forced to turn away from fire from our own tanks. Now, the 3rd Panzer Division had the following to say. During the night of 11th to 12th January, the Russians launched repeated attacks from the west, which were repelled by riflemen and tanks. Firing high explosive shells had become almost impossible for the tanks, since the muzzle flash gave away their positions and they were immediately engaged by the T-34s. So remember, T-34s were established here and also in Shumakovo, and were apparently firing quite accurately. On 12th January, in the afternoon, after a comparatively quiet morning, the Russians attacked repeatedly from the west and northwest, following heavy artillery, tank and mortar fire. These attacks were repulsed. 5 more of our tanks were knocked out by direct hits from T-34s. A direct hit struck the battalion command post, killing Oberleutnant Müller-Hauf and wounding several officers and men of the infantry battalion. Note that this, according to the infantry, happened 1 day earlier. So that's where that confusion came from. The losses of Company Müller-Hauf thus rose to 5 dead and 17 wounded. In the north and west, the Russians succeeded for a time in penetrating into the houses. Again, this was claimed to have happened a day earlier by the infantry. But by 1800 hours, the attacks had been repelled everywhere. At this point, we can look at the Russian documentation for some additional details. Namely, one of the Panzer III tanks that were destroyed on the 12th of January was attributed to the crew of the Commissar of the Medium Tank Company of the 2nd Tank Battalion, political instructor Alexander Kretov. Now, what's interesting here is, and we should talk about this, who were the Soviets opposing this? So, the tanks mostly came from the 14th Tank Brigade. And according to the Soviet documents, by the evening of January 12, 1942, according to the headquarters of the 40th Army, the 14th Tank Brigade had 25 tanks, 1 KV-1, 12 T-34 and 12 T-26 in working order. 6 tanks, 1 KV-1 and 5 T-34s were undergoing medium repairs, 12 T-26 were awaiting major repairs, and 2 tanks, 1 KV-1 and 1 T-34 were stuck in ditches and required evacuation, which was impossible due to the lack of the necessary tractors. There were, however, other sources who say there were only 21 tanks left, so there's some detail difference here. The infantry in the area was mostly from the 2nd Guards Rifle Division, the Soviet infantry, that is. Back to the report by the German infantry. During the day, the enemy carried out active aerial reconnaissance. It was intended, with the onset of darkness, to evacuate all the wounded. However, this was only partially successful, because around 1800 hours, heavy concentrated fire began from 3 directions: south, east, and northwest. The unified command of this fire was clearly recognizable, combining artillery, tanks, and heavy mortars. This fire caused direct hits on several houses, including those sheltering wounded, which significantly increased casualties. Urgent request to the Division for Artillery support could not be met, as a battery positioned near Melidovka was out of range and could not reach the enemy artillery located southwest of Kritasovo. Kritasovo, of course, is this area here, so southwest of that there must have been maybe close to Ivanovka enemy Russian artillery firing, and the Germans, of course, mostly were fighting in this area, which is also where all the wounded transports from last video went. So yeah, they were quite in a pickle here. So the tanks also report this. At 20-15 hours, heavy fire, especially mortars, fell again on the road junction east of the bridge. Track noises from the bridge suggested the approach of tanks. At that moment, the bridge should have been blown, but the demolition did not occur, because the demolition squad had abandoned its post after the artillery barrage. In this way, 2 Russian tanks, BT type, managed to cross the bridge, and one of them drove along the village street. Now, there are some things to note here. First of all, to remind you, these are the 3 bridges here, and this was a bridge that should have been blown. Apparently the Russian tanks drove here. They were misidentified due to it being dark as BT tanks, but as we heard, these were T-26s, and the Russian documents actually have some details here on these tanks that just basically drove into the middle of this village in the middle of the evening. It says in the blog, it follows from the award sheets that one of the tanks that broke through to Wypolzowo on the evening of January 12th was the T-26 of the commander of the light tank company of the 1st Tank Brigade, 1st Tank Battalion, Lieutenant Nikolai Kashirin, the driver mechanic Senior Sergeant Mikhail Morozov, turret gunner Sergeant Pavel Zhugan. It was probably Kashirin who led this tank breakthrough. During the battle, the tank was hit, the entire crew was wounded, but he was still able to withdraw the tank from Wypolzowo. Kashirin himself is listed in most documents as having died of his wounds on January 13th. So there are also versions of January 12th and 14th. The second tank to break through to the Eastern Bank was the T-26 of Sergeant Major Dmitry Medvedev from the 2nd Tank Battalion, and the third tank, so apparently there were 3, was the T-26 machine gun tank of the 1st Tank Battalion Platoon Lieutenant Dmitry Vasilyev, who, according to Vasilyev's award sheet, destroyed 4 Germans in the battle for the crossing. So yeah, apparently they broke through with 3 tanks. Germans counted 2 at one point. The infantry actually in their report also say 3, so they counted better. It was a chaotic battle, and apparently at least one tank commander died. What I find interesting here is that the machine gun version of the T-26 was used. The machine gun version was this weird abomination with two machine gun turrets, which apparently was one of these three tanks. Quite an unusual vehicle, and obviously one of those that wasn't produced after the war broke out in 1941. Back to the German report. So it's talking about these Russian tanks. One of them drove along the village street. There it was attacked by Lieutenant Huhn and some tank crewmen with hand grenades and pistols. Due to the darkness, no hits could be scored on the enemy tanks by our own panzers. So basically, the panzers were useless and they went out on foot. Lieutenant Huhn was wounded by a pistol shot fired from the BTs. Both BTs then withdrew back across the bridge to the west. Strong tank noises were also heard during the night from the southeast, otherwise the night remained relatively quiet. The bridge over the same was blown, so later they did blow it up. So yeah, it's interesting here that apparently their infantry assaults did cause enough damage to later kill that one tank commander, but apparently at least one of them scored a hit with probably his Nagant revolver out of the tank, I would have to imagine. The infantry concludes the report for this day. Around 2100 hours, the enemy fire subsided. Throughout the night, however, occasional fire strikes occurred, often accompanied by probing attacks of small reconnaissance patrols. Otherwise, the night until the morning of 13th January remained relatively quiet, apart from light artillery fire. Now, 13th January, still with the infantry. In the morning hours, observation showed that columns and tanks were withdrawing southeast from Shumakovo. So along this axis here. At the same time, the division reported that an attack was planned along the west bank of the Seine towards the southeast in order to establish contact with the battalion and also assure artillery support. These developments strengthened the battalion's conviction that Wypolzowo could be held. The tanks say, on the morning of 13th January, rearward movements of Russian troops from Shumakovo to the south, about 2 companies, were observed. And again, here we see that the timelines are synced up again. So the confusion here seems to have been over. The morning of 13th January remained quiet. Through Motorcycle Battalion 3, supported by 5 tanks, contact with Wypolzowo was re-established from the north. And again, here, that's something that the infantry said happened on the 12th. But it's interesting here that 5 tanks apparently reinforced them here. Back to the infantry, the battalion was well aware of the importance of this location, which controlled both the enemy's line of communication from the east and the crossing over the Seine. The battalion remained determined to fulfill its mission, so vital for the overall situation, by every possible means. During the course of 13th January, the enemy repeatedly renewed its attacks, supported by flanking fire from tanks positioned under cover in the area of Krydasovo. So again, down here. Throughout the day, the enemy fired very accurate, harassing artillery fire at irregular, sometimes multi-hour intervals. Tanks go into more detail. Around 1600 hours, Russian flak fired down the village street from the south. Oh, probably down here. Apparently in response to the arrival of the new tanks. Immediately afterwards, heavy artillery, tank and mortar fire began. A direct hit struck the aid station, destroying the facilities that had been prepared for the evacuation of the wounded. Again, something that happened last time, apparently. Lieutenant Stoib advanced with his platoon against the enemy infantry attack, which had now begun from the south, and repelled it. On divisional orders, the tanks that had been securing Wypolzowo during the past several days were ordered to march to Bunino, carrying with them about 30 wounded. The transport of the wounded also took place under enemy fire. So Bunino, obviously, up here. Between 21 hours and 22 hours, a surprise attack by Russian infantry, some on skis and some in snow smocks, struck the northeastern part of Wypolzowo. This attack was repulsed with the support of the tanks. The infantry also note enemy observation posts were identified on the Kolkos heights, possibly here, and engaged by the battalion's tanks and heavy weapons. However, once again, the artillery required to destroy these observation posts was lacking. Enemy artillery fire continuously caused significant casualties, further reducing the battalion's combat strength. A particularly difficult circumstance was that more and more houses were being shot to pieces. For example, 2nd Company could scarcely find any shelter from the harsh weather. Obviously it was snowy, it was January. During the night of 13th to 14th January, for the first time, ammunition and rations were resupplied from Benino, from the north. So, 14th January. Around 0200 hours following heavy artillery preparation, the enemy attacked with 2 companies in a coordinated assault simultaneously against a 3rd company on the southern edge of the village, so down here, and 2nd company on the eastern edge, so probably these axes here. The attack was repulsed, inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. By daylight, at least 40 dead could be counted in front of 2nd Company's position. 3rd Company, however, had to abandon several houses that had been completely destroyed by tank fire. 14th January brought new heavy attacks, particularly against 2nd Company. These assaults were supported by 2 tanks, which appeared in the small forests northeast of Wypolzowo. So, nowhere in here. In this situation, a single gun with special ammunition would have been of enormous help to the battalion. The tanks report on 14th January at midday, heavy artillery mortar fire again struck the village, an enemy attack from the west against the northern part of Wypolzowo, during which it was observed that the Russian infantrymen were being driven forward with rifle butt blows, collapsed under the fire of the tanks and the infantry battalion. Back to the infantry. Otherwise, the 14th January unfolded much like the preceding days. Occasional enemy thrusts were successfully repelled. Once again, the enemy delivered heavy weapons harassing fire at irregular intervals. During the night of 14th to 15th January, a number of additional wounded were successfully evacuated. Enemy night operations were beaten back. Even in the early morning hours of 15th January, the enemy maintained its by now familiar harassing fire. The tanks have this to say for the evening. At 1900 hours, a sled convoy carrying 50 to 60 wounded, which had set out northwards, was ambushed in the northern part of the village by Russian infantry with hand grenades and had to turn back. After the houses were cleared by elements of Motorcycle Battalion 3 and 1st Battalion, the sled convoy was finally able to set out towards Benino at 0130 hours on 15th January under the protection of a tank. So they did manage to get some more people out. But on the 15th January, their situation worsened quite a bit. The infantry has this to say. Around 1000 hours, the enemy once again opened concentrated artillery, tank and heavy mortar fire directed mainly against 2nd Company. It had the impression that the enemy intended to break through at 2nd Company's position. Suddenly, 2 heavy tanks advanced from the Kolkhoz heights, pushing right up to the first houses on the eastern edge of Wypolzowo, where they initially halted. After this, 1 enemy company attacked in line formation, but was caught in flanking fire from our own positions in Wypolzowo south. At the same time, at least 1 more enemy company, supported by 5 medium tanks, attacked 3rd Company in Wypolzowo south. This assault too was prepared by heavy artillery fire, during which the commander of 3rd Company was mortally wounded. In addition, the enemy delivered flanking machine gun fire from the area of Maksimovo. This is a bit confusing because this was still in their hands. Maybe they meant Mashkino from here, but yeah, that's a bit confusing. By this stage, the battalion was already engaged from 2 sides. The 2nd Company reported that its position could no longer be held and that the company had withdrawn to the northernmost houses of the eastern part of the village. This report was confirmed again by Feldwebel Braun of 2nd Company. The battalion commander had been with 3rd Company since the beginning of the engagement. However, the southern part of Wypolzowo could no longer be held against the combined pressure of the heavy artillery and the tank attack. The battalion commander then gave the order, "Position cannot be held. The battalion will withdraw northwards to the 3rd Rifle Battalion, or rather the 3rd Motorcycle Battalion." Up to that point, continuous radio messages had been sent, including requests for artillery support on Wypolzowo south, as well as notification of the enemy tank breakthrough. But the commander's final order to withdraw could no longer be transmitted to division headquarters, as the radio set had by then been destroyed. The withdrawal itself could not be carried out as systematically as planned due to the already heavy officer losses. The company commanders of 1st, 3rd and 4th companies were all down. The enemy quickly noticed the movement and made the retreat more difficult by blocking off the village center and northern part. Renewed heavy artillery fire then knocked out the last 5 operational tanks. This is from the tank report again. On 15th January at daybreak, Wypolzowo came under heavy artillery, tank and mortar fire from all sides. Tank fire was observed from the wooded area east of Wypolzowo and from Maksimovo. 3 of the 4 tanks still remaining in Wypolzowo to secure the village exits received multiple hits, forcing the crews to dismount. Among them was the only still operational Panzer IV. Its crew, after setting fire to the special ammunition with hand grenades, fought their way northwards with a dismounted machine gun and mounted a Panzer III that had earlier been immobilized by hits to its engine in order to fire on a T-34 approaching from the east along with Russian infantry. And the electrical firing circuit for the main gun failed. Firing had to be discontinued. The battalion and the dismounted tank crews were then forced to withdraw northwards under the combined assault of Russian infantry attacking from all sides, supported by a total of 10 T-34s. The last operational Panzer III, commanded by Feldwebel Göring, was also lost to a direct hit. It is noteworthy that the tank of Lieutenant Stoib scored 2 hits at a range of about 20 meters and 4 hits at 50 meters with 5 cm Panzergranate 40 ammunition on a T-34 driving down the village street without any observable effect. We carry on with the infantry. In the street fighting that now broke out, events unfolded rapidly. An attempt by the battalion commander himself to disable one of the enemy tanks by throwing a bundle charge failed. Around the same time, the commander of 2nd Company, according to statements by Feldwebel Rieger of 2nd Company, though I did not witness it myself, leapt onto another enemy tank in an attempt to disable it by throwing hand grenades into the hatch. The crew noticed him, however, and the tank quickly swung its turret, hurling Oberleutnant Helfrich to the ground. He was then run over by a following tank which turned in place several times, literally crushing him to pieces. One of our own tanks, though immobile, was still able to fire, probably that Panzer III mentioned. It opened fire at the advancing enemy tanks from a range of only 15 meters. The shells, however, failed to penetrate and merely deflected off to the sides. This is reliably attested by Unteroffizier Denk of 4th Company, who survived. Particular mention must be made of the conduct of the battalion's doctor, assistant physician Dr. Tören, who fell in action. He had already been lightly wounded on 11th January and more seriously wounded on the 13th and 14th, yet he remained with the wounded waiting for a replacement to arrive. Dr. Tören was the battalion's only physician. On 15th January, I still saw him at work during the enemy's preparatory artillery fire. When I returned later, however, he was no longer in the increasingly demolished house. According to several witnesses, Dr. Tören was finally killed by a direct hit on one of the makeshift aid stations. I was the last man of 3rd Company to disengage from the enemy. Only when there was no one left from 3rd Company did I break through northwards. I did not find the severely wounded battalion commander along the way. According to Gefreiter Kallup of the 1st Company, who was the last man with Major Schmidt, it was impossible to bring the commander out. Kallup and another soldier tried to rescue him on one of the last still mobile tanks, but at that very moment the tank received another direct hit and burned out. Major Schmidt must have been hit again during this. Since he showed no further signs of life, Gefreiter Kallup finally withdrew, having remained with his commander until the very last. In the meantime, the enemy had shifted its artillery fire to seal off the northern part of the village. On the way north, I encountered Lieutenant Mösbauer of 4th Company. 4th Company is here. Yeah, of 4th Company. Together we attempted to form new resistance group from the remnants of 1st, 2nd and 4th Companies, numbering about 25 men. However, when the heavy tanks described earlier pushed forward from the east, clearly intending to block our route north, and since we had only 3 light machine guns left and not even a single hand grenade, I ordered these elements as well to continue fighting their way back. This was necessary because, at the same time, enemy infantry was entering the village from all directions and flanking fire from the west was steadily increasing. This flanking fire from Shumakovo, probably from here as well, in fact played a very significant role throughout the entire battle. The battalion suffered most of all from the fact that the enemy, still positioned in Shumakovo, could not be effectively engaged by us, yet was able to bring every movement under observed machine gun fire. During this fighting withdrawal, Lieutenant Mösbauer was mortally wounded by machine gun fire, while Lieutenants Eger and Bayer were killed by shell splinters. Elements of 2nd Company were able to disengage from the enemy, but while retreating over the heights northeast of Wypolzowo, they suffered heavy losses from artillery fire. Eventually, the remaining elements, initially consisting of 1 officer and 78 men, managed to fall back to Mashnino. So they reached over here. There they were assigned to strengthen the security of Motorcycle Battalion 3. At nightfall, I attempted, with my own elements and 1 platoon of motorcycle troops, to launch a violent counterattack towards Wypolzowo in the hopes of recovering wounded and equipment. This attempt failed, however, against the enemy, who was already strongly entrenched and supported by tanks. The abandonment of Wypolzowo became unavoidable, because the battalion had no effective weapons against the enemy's heavy and medium tanks. In addition, the battalion was constantly exposed without protection to enemy artillery fire, which only digging in could have mitigated, but digging in was impossible due to the severe frost prevailing throughout the days. The number of available cellars was also insufficient. From the battalion, which had entered combat at Shumakovo on 8th January with 11 officers, 71 NCOs and 401 enlisted men, the following have, as far as determined, returned unwounded: 1 officer, 22 NCOs and 135 enlisted men. Additionally, before the final fighting, 3 officers and around 150 NCOs and men had been evacuated as wounded. Officer losses are firmly established. The determination of NCO and enlisted losses is not yet complete. The number of dead positively confirmed so far is about 100, but given the circumstances, the 139 NCOs and enlisted reported missing must be assumed to mean an equal number of dead. Signed, Kaiser, Oberleutnant. This is now the report by the tanks. In total, 9 tanks were lost at Wypolzowo between 11th and 15th January, all total losses. Only 10 men of the tank crews reached Bunino unwounded, so they retreated up here. In considering the battle for Wypolzowo, the extremely unfavorable terrain of the village must be taken into account. The houses of the village stood on the east side of the main street with gaps of 30 to 80 meters. To the west, the ground sloped down towards the river, so that every movement was under precise enemy observation from the west bank of the same. In order to find even a measure of cover, the tanks had to take up positions along the east side of the houses, which greatly limited their ability to fight effectively. For this reason, on the afternoon of 14th January 1942, the battalion recommended pulling the tanks back to Bunino or Mashnino, where a counterattack was to be prepared. This proposal, however, was not accepted for reasons of morale. Signed, Oberstleutnant Schmidt-Ott, Commander, Panzerabteilung. So, the battle was over. Now, just to remind you, this was the 3rd Panzer Division at this point. So, Company Müller-Hauf at this point, which was shortly before the battle, had 10 tanks. Müller-Hauf obviously did not survive this battle. 9 of these 10 tanks was gone. So at this point, this Panzer Division basically had no tanks or only a few tanks in repair left. So they were completely bled out from this engagement. This one apparently was still not in the area. Because of that, I would say that this is one of the more catastrophic battles I've read about, and one that made Panzer Division ultimately combat ineffective. It also showed that the Germans were so depleted that the complete strength of a panzer company was basically used to defend a single village, and ended up not even being enough. Lastly, I want to look at a quick report here from February 1942, so a couple of weeks after this battle. And it says here, subject: experiences in combat employment, particularly in the use of newly arrived units from France, which are not yet accustomed to the Russian campaign. Now, some of this stuff here is stuff like Munitionstaktik. They use too much ammunition, okay? Or that they are often overly excitable when it comes to their reports. Right, and that there are rules here which language to use for which tactical situation, that kind of thing. And I like also the final part here, self-help in the troop, which basically says, well, shit's fucked, but deal with it. Now, what I want to look at though is this first part here, which I will read out, which is actually quite interesting and also maybe shows why the Germans assumed that all those who remained in the village were probably dead. It says here, prisoners of war. The fact that few prisoners of war have been taken recently is due, on the one hand, to the lack of any German propaganda activity. As a result, the Russians no longer desert, but instead defend themselves to the last, even in the hardest fighting. On the other hand, it must be noted that German troops themselves no longer take prisoners, but instead shoot prisoners of war on the battlefield after their capture. And there's something blacked out here. I wonder if there stood something there like without reason or something that they didn't want in this official report. I don't know. It goes on to say, although the bitterness of our own troops is understandable, since our soldiers are repeatedly found stripped naked and in some cases mutilated, and also the transport of prisoners represents a significant burden and difficulty given our weak combat strength, the weather and transport situation, such a practice has very serious consequences for the future conduct of the war. Through the constant flow of information to the Russians via local civilians, both the Russian leadership and the individual Russian soldier become aware of these facts. The Russian leadership exploits every such case it learns of for propaganda purposes. As a result, Russian soldiers fight to the last, since they can expect certain death if they surrender or desert. This is also one of the main reasons for the severity of the recent fighting. The division itself had great successes in the summer with its own propaganda leaflets with safe conduct passes, which saved it from considerable losses by inducing enemy desertions. However, any propaganda becomes worthless when such incidents occur. It is also very difficult to disprove, for propaganda purposes, a rumor that has already spread widely. Since eliminating the Russian opponent through his capture will be of decisive importance when the offensive is resumed, propaganda preparation for this cannot begin early enough. It is therefore urgently necessary that every negative factor preventing desertion be eliminated as far as possible. The division therefore proposes that this issue be taken up again at higher levels and regulated by a strict order. In particular, it appears necessary to point out that in the end the troops harm themselves the most by shooting prisoners. This was not only the case on the German side. Reading from the Russian blog, it says here, according to the 14th Tank Brigade headquarters report, while heading to the Semibratski area, this was actually a couple of days, or it was during the early days of this battle, a bit to the north as far as I know. While heading to the Semibratski area, the brigade encountered a column of the 299th Infantry Division retreating from Wypolzowo in the area of Gudinkin Farm, 4 kilometers south of the Semibratski farm, and routed it with tanks. At first, the 14th Tank Brigade headquarters reported the destruction of 400 Germans and more than 100 vehicles during the rout of the enemy column. However, 2 days later, it provided slightly more realistic figures for the damage inflicted on the enemy: 4 anti-tank guns, 60 officers and soldiers, over 100, it says here, submarines, that's a glitch in the translation, 2 radio stations, 2 kitchens, and 15 vehicles were destroyed. Several prisoners were also captured, including 1 German officer. All prisoners were shot, probably due to the impossibility of escorting them to the rear in the difficult conditions that had arisen. Both sides at this point in the fighting on the Eastern Front did not take any prisoners here. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this very detailed battle report. One last thing we can actually look at now. In the past, I've sometimes made my own kind of graphics. In this case, it's not really that necessary because the terrain is still actually very close to how it looked like back then. But one thing we can look at is actually a Russian map of the area. This is also from that Russian blog, and the map is apparently from 1941. And as you can see, it looks very, very similar. Maybe a few buildings are different here and there. It seems like the actual village was a bit more or a bit bigger back then. But yeah, you can see Wypolzowo here. The forest is also still seen on Google Earth. So yeah, I didn't go for my own map in this case because, as you can see, it's just the same area really. Anyway, as I said, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.